The sound came first. Not the wind, not the snow pelting the walls like gravel. It was a crack, long and slow, the kind of sound a tree makes just before it falls. Except this sound came from above their heads, from the roof beams that Thomas had promised to replace before winter, from the joists he had sworn would hold one more season. Clara was sitting against the far wall with Ellie pressed to her chest when she heard it. The baby had been fussing all evening, her skin carrying a blue tint that no amount of fur or friction could chase away. Across the room, Wyatt lay curled beside the cold stove, his small body shaking with a cough that had grown worse every night for a week. There was blood on his sleeve, not much, but enough. She looked up. The ceiling bowed inward like a tired spine, and in the orange flicker of the last candle stub, she saw the center beam split. It didn't snap clean. It peeled apart fibers separating like wet rope, and then the weight of the snow above pushed through. The first section of roof came down in a shower of frozen dirt and splintered wood. The stovepipe buckled sideways. Cold air rushed in like water filling a hull. Clara did not scream. She rolled to her left, shielding Ellie beneath her body, and reached for Wyatt with her free hand. The boy was already moving, scrambling toward her on all fours, his eyes wide, his mouth open but silent. The second beam gave way, and then there was nothing above them but sky. She pulled both children into the corner where the stone chimney still stood, the only part of the cabin that hadn't surrendered. Snow fell on them through the open wound in the roof, white flakes landing on Ellie's blanket, on Wyatt's hair, on Clara's bare hands. The wind followed, and with it a cold so sharp it felt personal. She knew then that the cabin was dead. It had been dying for months. The wood was soft with rot. The chinking between the logs had crumbled in the November rains, and the chimney had been leaking smoke into the room instead of drawing it up and out. Thomas was supposed to fix all of it. Thomas was supposed to be here. He had stood in that doorway 5 weeks ago, his pack on his shoulder, and told her 3 weeks, and he would be back with pay from the lumber crew at Mason's Creek 3 counties east. She had been nursing Ellie at the time and only nodded. She didn't say, "Be careful." She didn't say, "I love you." She just nodded, and he walked into the tree line, and the trees swallowed him, and that was the last time. She waited 3 weeks, then 4. Then the snow came and the passes closed, and she stopped walking to the ridge to look for him. She wept once quietly after the children were asleep. Then she worked. She patched the roof with pine boughs. She stuffed rags into the gaps in the walls. She rationed the dried beans and salt pork and told herself he would come when the weather broke. But the weather did not break, and neither did the roof. Now she crouched in the ruin of everything they had built together, holding 2 children who were running out of warmth, and she made the only decision left. She would not stay here. She would not try to rebuild this cabin with no timber, no tools, and no man to swing an axe. She would go down the slope to the spot she had found 3 days ago, a shallow pocket below the ridge where 3 walls of natural stone formed a cradle in the mountainside. It was sheltered from the wind on every side but one. It faced away from the sun. No man would have chosen it for anything. But Clara was not any man, and she had run out of choices. She wrapped Ellie in the old buffalo hide, the one Thomas had traded 2 pelts for at the general store the autumn before. She pulled Wyatt to his feet and buttoned his coat, the one with the torn lining that let the cold through at the shoulders. She took the iron spade, the pickaxe, the cracked lantern, with its last pool of oil, and the canvas sack with what remained of their food. She left everything else. They walked down in the dark before sunrise. The snow was knee-deep in places, and Wyatt sank with every step, his thin legs churning through the crust. He didn't complain. He never complained. At 5 years old, he was already quieter than most grown men Clara had known, and when he looked up at her with those dark eyes, she saw something that frightened her more than the cold. She saw trust, complete and unquestioning. The man appeared between the trees when they were halfway down the slope. He stepped out of the shadows like he had been standing there all along, which perhaps he had. Old Bridger. She knew him only by reputation and 2 brief encounters at the creek in autumn. A trapper who had lived alone on this mountain for longer than anyone could say. His beard was white, His coat was patched with so many different hides it looked like a quilt, and his eyes had the flat, careful quality of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. He blocked the path, not aggressively, just planted himself there like a fence post and looked at her, then at the children. "Where are you going with those two in the dark?" "Cabin's gone," Clara said. "Roof collapsed. I'm taking them down to the hollow below the south ridge." Bridger's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That hollow ground there is soft over shale. When the spring melt comes, that slope will slide. You'll be buried. We'll be dead before spring if I don't get them out of the wind tonight. Then go down to the valley. There are settlements. Someone will take you in." Clara adjusted Elliot on her hip. The baby's breathing was shallow, each inhale a tiny rasp. Wyatt stood behind her, gripping her coat with one hand, coughing into the other. She looked at Bridger and spoke evenly. "My boy has been coughing blood for a week. My girl turns blue every time the temperature drops. I cannot walk them 20 miles down a mountain in the dark through waist-deep snow to beg strangers for a floor to sleep on. I need shelter now, tonight, and that hollow is all I've got." Bridger looked at the children for a long moment. Then he looked past them up the slope toward the broken ridge where smoke no longer rose. When he spoke again, his voice had no warmth in it and no cruelty either. It was simply flat. "I've lived alone on this mountain for a reason, ma'am. Don't bring those children near my camp." He stepped off the path and walked into the trees without looking back. The darkness took him in 3 strides, and then it was just Clara in the wind and the sound of Wyatt's breathing behind her. She stood there for a moment, feeling something settle in her chest that was different from fear and different from anger. It was the understanding that she was alone in a way she had not been before. Not alone because Thomas was gone. Alone because another human being had looked at her dying children and chosen to walk away. She reached down and took Wyatt's hand. "Come on, baby. Where are we going, Mama?" She looked down the slope toward the dark mass of stone she could barely see in the pre-dawn gray. She squeezed his fingers. "I'm going to dig us a house inside this mountain." He didn't understand, but he nodded and they walked. The hollow was exactly as she remembered it. 3 walls of exposed rock, the tallest about 8 feet, forming a rough U shape open to the south. The ground inside was frozen, but not as hard as the exposed ridge above. Centuries of leaf fall and snow melt had deposited a thick layer of soil against the rock, and beneath that she could feel the give of clay. It was workable. Barely. She set Ellie between 2 boulders at the base of the tallest rock face, tucking the buffalo hide around her, so only her face showed. The baby whimpered, her tiny fingers grasping at air. Clara leaned close and whispered something her own mother used to say in the dark back in the valley, back before the war, and the westward push and the long years of trying to make soil grow what it didn't want to grow. "Shh, this ground isn't your enemy, baby girl. It's only cold because it doesn't know you yet." Then she picked up the spade and began to dig. The first strike rang through the mountain air like a bell. The ground fought back, frozen solid in the top 6 inches, and every blow sent a shock up through the handle into her wrists and shoulders. She switched to the pickaxe, breaking the crust in short, savage chops, then scooped the loosened earth out with the spade. Her rhythm was clumsy at first, but it found itself within the first hour, a pattern of break, and clear, her breath fogging white in the gray light. She was not digging a cabin. She was not building a shack. She had no wood for walls, no nails, no beams. What she needed was something beneath the wind, a place the snow would pass over instead of batter through a place so low and so hidden that winter itself might forget they were there. She chose to dig into the slope rather than down. Thomas had shown her why once on a walk through the high meadow when they passed a deer's burrow carved into a hillside. "Animals don't dig holes," he said. "They dig into slopes. Water runs out instead of pooling in. Air moves through instead of sitting dead." She had laughed at him that day, told him he talked like a philosopher. Now she dug exactly the way he described, angling the entrance slightly downward for the first 2 feet, then leveling out so meltwater would drain away from the interior. She would only need to think about this once. After today, the angle would speak for itself every time it rained. Wyatt sat on a flat rock near the entrance with Ellie in his arms. His teeth chattered so hard, Clara could hear them between pickaxe strikes. But he held his sister like it was the only job in the world, and maybe it was. That first night they didn't sleep. Clara lit the last of the pine pitch in the cracked lantern and hung it from a branch while she worked. The yellow light threw her shadow huge against the rock wall, a hunched figure swinging and scraping, swinging and scraping. Every time she considered resting, she heard the wind shift direction, or Ellie let out a thin cry, and she swung harder. By the second evening, she had carved a hollow in the hillside big enough for the three of them to lie down flat. It was not tall enough to stand in, it was not dry enough to sleep in without shivering. But it was darker than outside, quieter than outside, and when she hung the old fir curtain from the ruined cabin across the entrance, weighted with stones at the bottom, she could almost believe the wind didn't know where they were anymore. But it was not enough. Dirt alone would not keep them alive. She needed insulation. She needed to trap heat. She needed air that didn't carry the damp chill of raw earth. That second night nearly ended everything. Clara had tucked Ellie against her chest inside the hollow, wrapping every scrap of fabric around the baby's body. Wyatt pressed against her back, his small warmth barely registering through her coat. The wind outside had died to a whisper, and in the sudden quiet, Clara heard something that made her blood stop. Nothing. She heard nothing from Ellie. No breathing, no whimper, no rasp. She pulled back the hide and touched her daughter's cheek. It was cold. Not the cold of a child sleeping in a chilly room, the cold of something that had stopped producing warmth. Clara's hands moved before her mind could catch up. She shoved bark into the ember pit, blew on the coals, until her vision spotted, and when the first reluctant flame caught, she stripped off her own shirt and pressed Ellie's body against her bare skin, pulling the buffalo hide over both of them. She held her daughter so close to the coals that her own skin blistered along her ribs and she did not move. She talked. Not to anyone who could hear, but because sound was the only thing she had left to give. She told Ellie about spring, about the way the dogwood bloomed along the creek in April white and pale pink, and how the bees came out from wherever bees went in winter, and how the grass turned so green it looked like someone had painted the whole valley overnight. She told her about Thomas bringing home a sack of cornmeal and a pair of new boots, about Wyatt learning to skip stones, about the smell of bread baking in an oven that worked. She told her stories that were not true and might never be true, and she held her daughter's cooling body against her burning skin, and the fire popped and hissed, and the wind outside found a new direction and screamed past the entrance without entering. At some point in the darkest hours, Ellie stirred, just barely. Her body shifted, her lips parted, and she let out one weak, rattling cough. Clara cried. She had not cried when the roof collapsed. She had not cried when Bridger walked away. She had not cried during 2 days of breaking frozen ground with bleeding hands. But she cried now, tears running silent down her face and onto her daughter's scalp, because that cough meant alive. That cough meant not yet. That cough meant keep digging. Outside, a storm hit. The kind that devoured entire homesteads and made strong men disappear between their barn and their front door. But inside the hollow, they heard only a muffled roar, like the mountain had cupped its hands around them. By morning, when the storm broke and gray light seeped through the fir curtain, Clara did not rest. She crawled outside into the blinding white, her legs barely holding her weight, and she looked at the buried world, the broken ridge above, the collapsed cabin somewhere behind them under the snow, the still heavy sky that meant the worst had passed for now. She needed more than a hole. She needed walls that would last. She needed to build a life inside this hill, not just a hiding place, and so she started again. She spent the third morning walking the slope, scanning the ground for the thickest patch of sod she could find. Dense, rooted turf bound together by a web of grass roots and held moist by weeks of snowmelt. The old mountain women used to cut this kind of earth into bricks and stack them like masonry building walls that held heat and shed rain better than any timber frame. Clara had heard the stories. Dugouts, earthen dens, homes burrowed into hillsides where families survived winters that killed everything above ground. This was not a story now. This was Tuesday morning, and she was cutting sod with a dulled blade that she had to sharpen every 20 minutes on a river rock, dragging the edge back and forth until it would bite again. Each brick weighed more than she expected. Thick as a loaf of bread, dark and dense, smelling of deep soil and root and the memory of rain. She carried them one at a time back to the hollow and began stacking them over the roof frame, pressing them into the gaps between the stone walls, packing the seams with her fists. Her knees were torn open. Her sleeves were stiff with dried blood. Her arms trembled so badly by afternoon that she dropped a sod brick on her own foot and had to sit down for 10 minutes pressing her face into her hands, breathing through the pain. But when the first layer of sod covered the roof completely, something changed. The cold did not vanish. It would never vanish. But it retreated. It pulled back half a step, and in that half step, Clara felt the first real warmth she had known in days. It did not come from fire. It came from the earth itself, from the accumulated heat of pale winter sun stored deep in the soil, released slowly through the night. The ground had been holding warmth all along, waiting for someone to seal it in. She dug a vent near the back of the chamber, using a hollow log packed with ash to guide airflow up and out. The first fire she built inside the sealed space filled the room with smoke so thick she couldn't see Wyatt's face. She adjusted the vent, widened it, angled the log. Smoke still rolled sideways some nights after that, but they weren't coughing. Not the deep blood-flecked cough, not anymore. On the fourth evening, Wyatt spoke for the first time in days. They were sitting near the ember pit, just glowing rocks and a strip of bark smoldering over them, and Wyatt reached out and touched the earthen wall with one finger. He held it there, feeling the faint warmth, the texture of root and clay and compressed life. "It smells like Papa's boots," he whispered. Clara's chest seized. She felt something crack behind her ribs, not bone, something deeper, something structural. She wanted to fold over and scream into the dirt. Instead, she kept her voice level. "That's how you know it's strong. He had strong boots." Wyatt nodded and pulled his hand back. He didn't ask where Papa was. He didn't ask when Papa was coming home. He just accepted the smell and the warmth and his mother's steady voice, and he lay down against the wall and closed his eyes. On the fifth morning, Clara found a dead rabbit outside the entrance. It had been skinned cleanly, the pelt removed in one piece, the body left on a flat rock like an offering. No footprints led to it. The snow around the entrance was undisturbed, except for a single set of moccasin tracks approaching from the north and retreating the same way. Bridger, he would not come down. He would not speak. He would not help directly. But he left a rabbit the way a man leaves a note he can't bring himself to write. Clara took the meat inside and did not waste a scrap. That same afternoon, she went to check the snare she had set along the rabbit run 50 yards east. The snare was empty, but the charred snow around it was not. There were footprints, boot prints, heavy, deep, fresh. The soles had left sharp rectangular marks, the kind made by manufactured boots with hard leather bottoms and iron heel plates. Not Bridger. Bridger wore soft-soled moccasins made of deer hide. These were a working man's boots or a drifter's, and they had come within 30 paces of the entrance to her shelter during the night. Someone had been watching them. Clara knelt beside the prints and placed her own hand flat on the snow next to one. Her spread fingers barely covered the heel. She followed the trail with her eyes. It came from the northwest, circled the area where she had been stacking sod, passed close enough to the entrance that the person would have seen the fur curtain and the faint glow of embers behind it, then continued south along the ridge before vanishing into a rocky stretch where snow didn't hold tracks. She walked back to the shelter, slowly keeping her breathing even, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound but wind and pine needles. She did not tell Wyatt. That night, after the children were asleep, she took the hunting knife and sat near the entrance with her back against the stone wall. She drew the blade along the flat edge of a slate rock once, twice, 10 times 20, until the steel gleamed faintly in the ember light. She kept it within arm's reach and did not sleep until the sky began to gray. 2 days later, Bridger came to the entrance of the shelter. He did not step inside. He stood in the cold with his hands at his sides and his breath clouding around his white beard, and he spoke quickly as if the words cost him something he didn't want to spend. That man whose tracks you found. I've seen him. Last winter north of here along the fur line. Name's Ransom Cobb. Two brothers ran trap lines up there. After Cobb passed through, both of them vanished. Nobody found bodies. Nobody found gear. Just empty camps. Clara stood in the entrance with Ellie on her hip. You know him? I know what I saw. And I saw him this morning up on the outcrop watching your snare line from the rocks. Silence. The wind picked up and blew snow dust between them. You're telling me this now, Clara said. It was not a question. Bridger looked at her, then at Wyatt, who had appeared behind her, silent as a shadow, watching the old man with Thomas's dark eyes. You dig well, Bridger said. Better than most men I've known. But digging deep won't save you from people. He turned and walked back into the trees. Clara watched him go. She stood there long after his footsteps faded, holding Ellie close, feeling Wyatt's hand grip the back of her coat. The mountain was silent around them. The sky was white, and somewhere above, on a rock outcrop she couldn't see from here, a man with iron-heeled boots was watching. That evening, Clara did not build the fire higher. She let it burn low, just enough glow to see by, and she began to work again. She dug a curved trench in front of the entrance, shallow but deliberate, creating a blind spot that would force anyone approaching to expose themselves before they could see the doorway. She cut stakes from green saplings and planted them at angles along the trench's inner edge. Not traps, warnings. She did not want to kill anyone. She wanted anyone who came close to understand that this was not an empty burrow. This was a place where someone was paying attention. When she finished long after midnight, she crawled back inside and looked at her children sleeping in the glow. Ellie lay curled in the buffalo hide, making soft sounds now. Instead of crying, her color better, her breathing steady. Wyatt slept with his back against the earthen wall, one small hand still curled around the whittling knife Clara had given him to hold. The belly, that was what she had started calling this place in her mind, though she hadn't said it aloud yet. It held them the way a body holds what it needs to survive, tight warm, hidden from everything that wanted to reach in and take. Outside, the snow began again, falling thick and silent over to the ridge, covering the trench, covering the stakes, covering the boot prints that had circled their home in the dark. Inside, the sod roof held. The earthen walls kept their warmth. The vent drew the smoke up and away, and a woman with blistered hands and a knife within reach sat in the amber light, watching her children breathe, knowing the mountain had given them one more night. But the boot print were still out there, under the fresh snow pressed into the frozen ground, pointing toward everything she had built. And the man who made them had not gone far. He came on the third day after Bridger's warning. Clara was reinforcing the drainage channel around the shelter's east side when she heard the branch snap. It was not the sound of wind or animal weight. It was the deliberate crack of a boot placed carelessly on deadfall, the sound of a man who was either careless or wanted to be noticed. She straightened up the spade still in her hand and looked toward the tree line. Ransom Cobb stepped out from behind a stand of hemlock as if he had been leaning against it, waiting for her to look up. He was tall and narrow through the chest, built like a man whose body had been consuming itself for weeks. His coat hung open despite the cold, the lining shredded, the buttons missing. The rifle slung over his shoulder was speckled with rust along the barrel, and the stock had been wrapped in a strip of cloth where the wood had cracked. His face was the worst part. Not the hollowed cheeks or the dark sockets around his eyes, but the expression, a thin smile that looked borrowed, like he had practiced it on the walk over. "Saw your smoke," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the kind of quiet that makes you listen harder than you want to. "Figured there might be a trading post up here. Been walking 2 weeks. Clara stood between him and the entrance. Behind the fur curtain, she could hear nothing, which meant Wyatt was doing exactly what she had taught him, staying silent, holding Ellie. "There's no trading post," Clara said. Cobb tilted his head. His eyes moved past her, over her shoulder, through the gap where the curtain didn't quite meet the stone. She knew what he could see. The strips of smoked rabbit hanging from the drying rack she had built from slate and bent tin. 3 days of food, maybe 4 if she stretched it. "Looks like you've got provisions, though." His smile widened by a fraction. "More than most folks I've come across up here." Clara adjusted her grip on the spade. She did not raise it. She did not step back. That food is for my children. If you need direction, there's a creek in the valley to the west with good water. If you need something else, you've come to the wrong place. Cobb looked at her. The smile stayed fixed, but his eyes were doing something different, measuring, calculating, running numbers that had nothing to do with friendship or trade. 3 seconds passed. 5. The wind pushed snow dust across the ground between them. Then he nodded once and turned to go. But before the trees took him, he stopped and spoke over his shoulder without looking back. Nice spot you've got here. Winter's going to be long. The words hung in the cold air after he was gone, and Clara stood motionless until she was certain his footsteps had faded completely. Then she went inside, pulled the curtain tight, and knelt in front of Wyatt. The boy was sitting in the back of the shelter with Ellie cradled in his lap. One hand over the baby's mouth, not pressing hard, just enough to muffle any sound. His eyes were steady. He had not moved since Clara first heard the branch snap. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did exactly right." That night she did not sleep, but this time it was not because of the cold. She waited until both children were breathing deeply. Then she took the spade and crawled to the south side of the shelter, where the rock wall met the hillside at a narrow angle. She lay on her side and began to dig. The second exit took her 6 hours. She carved it horizontally through compacted earth and root. Her face pressed against the ground, dirt falling into her eyes and mouth and ears. She worked by feel in complete darkness, pushing the loosened soil behind her, with her feet inching forward like something burrowing for its life. When her hand finally broke through into open air, cold wind rushed across her knuckles and she almost wept with relief. The tunnel emerged behind a fallen pine tree 30 paces from the main entrance, concealed from every angle by the trunk and a low shelf of rock. She covered the opening with a flat stone and packed snow around the edges until it was invisible. Back inside, she woke Wyatt gently and led him through the tunnel, on hands and knees, letting him feel every turn, every change in the width of the passage, memorizing it with his body, the way animals memorize escape routes. "If I ever say the word sunset," she told him, her hands on his shoulders, her face close to his in the dark, "you pick up Ellie and you go through this tunnel. You don't wait for me. You don't look back. You come out behind the pine tree and you go downhill. Do you understand?" He nodded once. He did not ask why. The days after Cobb's visit compressed into a rhythm that was equal parts labor and vigilance. Clara worked from the first gray light until her arms refused to lift the spade, and then she worked another hour on her knees, packing walls, adjusting the vent, shoring up the places where moisture had begun to soften the ceiling. But now she worked with her ears open and her knife on her belt, and she never turned her back to the tree line for more than a few seconds. Food became the crisis she had been postponing. The dried beans were gone. She had boiled pine needles into a thin broth that tasted of turpentine and made Wyatt's face twist, but he drank it without complaint. She chewed dried moss until her jaw ached. She scraped the inner bark of birch trees and ground it between two stones into a coarse flour that she mixed with snowmelt into a paste. It had no flavor and almost no substance, but it sat in the stomach and tricked the body into believing it had been fed. The snare lines went untouched for days. One morning she found a snare with the cord chewed clean through the bait, gone the trigger stick snapped. Something had taken the food without getting caught, and whatever it was had been smart enough not to come back. She reset the snare 3 times with different configurations, adjusting the loop. With the trigger tension, the height of the bait. Thomas had taught her this years ago before Ellie was born, kneeling beside her in the autumn light with his patient hands shaping the cordage. Her fingers were clumsy now, stiff with cold and exhaustion, but she kept at it. On the third morning, Wyatt found the rabbit. He came running back from the snare line with the animal held high above his head, his eyes wider than Claire had seen them since the cabin fell. It was a snowshoe hare fat with its winter coat dangling from the loop by one hind leg. Wyatt held it like a trophy, like proof that the world had not entirely turned against them. Clara killed it fast. She had learned to do that much from Thomas, a quick pull and twist that ended things before the animal could register fear. She skinned it in the shelter's entrance, saving the pelt, scraping every ribbon of meat from bone, cracking the bones themselves for marrow. That evening, they ate stew made from rabbit and pine needle broth and a handful of bark flour, and it tasted like something worth surviving for. She built a smoke shell the next day from two pieces of flat slate propped against each other over a bed of low coals. The rabbit meat sliced thin and hung above the smoke would last longer than raw. Not forever, but enough to stretch the distance between catching and starving. Wyatt had begun making things. She noticed it first when she found a rough spoon carved from a knothole, then a small bowl hollowed from a chunk of dead wood, then a set of pegs whittled to a point and driven into the wall to hold strips of drying meat. He worked silently, always his small hands busy while his mouth stayed closed. She watched him sometimes when he didn't know she was looking, and she saw something in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes focused on the task in front of him, that she recognized. Not Thomas's warmth, not his easy laugh, or his habit of humming while he worked. What Wyatt had inherited was the stubbornness, the refusal to sit idle, the need to do something with his hands, even when there was nothing useful to be done. He was 5 years old, and he was building things so his family could eat. Cobb came back on a night when the moon was hidden. Clara heard footsteps on crusted snow and came awake instantly, her hand closing around the knife handle before her eyes opened. The footsteps were not approaching the entrance. They were moving laterally toward the east, toward the snare line. She touched Wyatt's shoulder. The boy's eyes opened without confusion. She placed her palm over his lips, then pointed toward the tunnel. He reached for Ellie, drew the baby into his chest, and shifted silently toward the escape route. Ready, waiting. Clara slipped through the fur curtain into the dark. The moon broke through a seam in the clouds just long enough for her to see him. Cobb was crouched 30 yards away, working the snare with both hands. Two rabbits lay on the ground beside him, their white fur bright against the snow. He had already taken them. He was resetting the trap, which meant he intended to come back. 2 rabbits, 3 days of food, maybe 4. The difference between her children eating and her children weakening to the point where the cold could finish what hunger started. She could stay hidden, let him take what he had already taken and disappear. Avoid the confrontation. Keep the peace. She stepped out into the open, the knife in her right hand, and walked toward him. Put them down! Cobb straightened up slowly. He turned to face her, a rabbit in each hand, his head tilted at that same careful angle. In the faint moonlight, his face looked carved from gray wood. You're braver than is smart for a woman alone out here, he said. I'm not alone. I have 2 children who need to eat. You have nothing to protect. Think about which one of us has less to lose. The silence stretched between them like a wire. Wind moved through the trees above, shaking loose a curtain of snow that fell between them in a slow drifting sheet. Clara could feel her heartbeat in her wrist, in the hand holding the knife, and she willed it steady. Cobb looked at the knife, looked at her face. Then he set one rabbit down on the snow, kept the other, and stood. Split, he said. Next time I won't split. He walked into the trees. She did not lower the knife until the sound of his boots on snow had faded to nothing, and then kept fading for another full minute beyond that. Then she picked up the rabbit and went inside and sat down in the dark with her back against the wall and shook for a long time without making a sound. In the morning, she went back to the spot where Cobb had stood. The snow was disturbed, his boot prints already filling with fresh powder. But beside the largest print, half buried in white, something caught the light. A ring, small silver, blackened with tarnish. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. On the inside of the band, 2 letters were scratched into the metal. T.W. Thomas Whitmore. Clara closed her fist around the ring. Her husband had been wearing this when he walked out the door 5 weeks ago. She remembered it on his right hand, the way it caught the light when he gripped the axe, the way he twisted it when he was thinking. He never took it off. How did Cobb get this ring? She put it in her coat pocket without saying a word to anyone and carried the question with her for the next week like a stone lodged beneath her ribs. She could not stay hidden forever. She knew that. The food would run out again, and when it did, there would be no Bridger leaving rabbits at her door. No lucky snare catches nothing between her children and starvation except whatever she could find beyond the ridge. She needed people, not for comfort, not for company, but for the mathematics of survival, More hands, more snares, more eyes watching the tree line. She carved a sign into a plank of wood salvaged from the old cabin and nailed it above the entrance of the shelter. Alive. 2 children. Will trade for salt grain boots. Then she left the children in Wyatt's care, gave him the hunting knife, and walked east. She found the Holts 2 days later living in the ruins of a collapsed feed barn, half buried in snow and pine boughs. Margaret Holt was crouched over a fire so small it barely deserved the name, feeding it twigs one at a time, her fingers raw and split. Silas Holt sat against the barn wall with his right hand cradled against his chest, the fingers black at the tips where frostbite had set in. Their daughter Dinah, 15 years old, lay on a pile of straw with her left foot wrapped in rags, her face gray, her eyes tracking Clara's movements with the dull wariness of a wounded animal. Clara gave them half her bark flour and 2 strips of smoked rabbit. Margaret took the food with shaking hands and said nothing for a long time. Silas looked at Clara, then at the food, then back at Clara. "Where did you come from?" "Up the ridge. I built a shelter in the hillside. Sod wall stone frame vented for smoke. It's held through 2 storms. Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You dug a hole in a hill and you're calling it a shelter. I'm calling it the reason my children are alive. It's a grave with a door is what it is. We'll wait here for help from the valley. Someone will come." Margaret looked at her husband, then at Dinah, who had not moved, whose breathing was shallow and uneven, whose wrapped foot had begun to smell like something Clara did not want to name. Then Margaret stood up. She was shorter than Clara by half a head, thin, trembling, but when she spoke, her voice had the particular hardness of a woman who had been patient long enough. "I'm going with her. You can stay if you want." Silas stared at his wife. Something moved across his face, pride and fear, and the particular shame of a man who knows he is being outpaced by people he is supposed to protect. He looked at Dinah, at the dying fire, at the snow beyond the barn walls that went on forever in every direction. He stood up and followed his wife out of the barn, not because he believed Clara, because he could not bear the thought of Margaret walking away without him. The journey back took 3 days. Dinah could not walk without support and had to lean on her mother with every step, dragging her wrapped foot through the snow. Silas moved stiffly, his injured hand pressed to his chest, his jaw clenched against pain he would not admit to. They rested every hour. Clara broke trail ahead of them, stamping down the snow with her boots, clearing branches, choosing the path of least resistance. She carried Dinah on her back for the last mile. When the girl's strength finally gave out, Dinah's head resting against Clara's shoulder blade, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. When they reached the shelter, Wyatt was standing in the entrance with Ellie in his arms. He saw the strangers coming through the trees, and for a moment his face did something Clara had never seen. It crumpled, his chin shook, his eyes filled. He cried quietly without making a sound, the tears freezing on his cheeks in the cold air. He had been alone with his infant sister for 2 days, and he had not broken until the moment he saw other human beings. Ellie, in contrast, shrieked with delight at the sight of new faces and reached out her arms toward Dinah with the unguarded joy of a baby who has not yet learned to be afraid of strangers. Clara dug the new chamber that same day. Fast, furious, as if something was chasing her, she extended the main dugout by 4 feet to the west, carved a low archway between the spaces, and packed the walls with everything she had. She taught Silas to compress sod with his one good hand, showed Margaret how to dry bark flour on heated stones, set Dinah to scraping pine resin into a tin cup with a flat blade, work the girl could do sitting down. Dinah hated every moment. She hated the dirt. She hated the smell. She hated the low ceiling that forced her to crouch, the smoke that stung her eyes, the mud that caked under her fingernails, and stayed there no matter how hard she scrubbed with snow. On the first night, she cried herself to sleep, calling the shelter a hole, a pit, a place for animals. Clara heard every word through the thin partition and said nothing. In the morning, she took Dinah outside. The girl limped on her bad foot, leaning against the rock wall, squinting in the white glare. Clara stood beside her and swept one arm across the frozen landscape. Ridge after ridge of snow-covered mountains, empty forest, No smoke, no structures, no sign of human life in any direction. "Do you see a house out there?" Clara asked. "A barn, a road, anything." Dinah said nothing. "This is all there is. You can cry. You've earned that. But when you're done crying, you start working. Because the mountain doesn't care about your feelings, and neither does the cold." Dinah hated Clara for 3 days. On the fourth day, she began packing sod without being asked. On the fifth, she asked Clara to show her how to angle the bricks so they locked together. By the end of the week, she could seal a wall joint tighter than Silas. It was Silas who found Cobb. He had been checking the snare line, working with his one functioning hand, when he came back to the shelter with a look on his face that Clara recognized instantly. The look of a man who has seen something he wishes he hadn't. "There's a dead man under the big spruce 1/4 mile north," Silas said. "Frozen solid, rifle beside him, packs open." Clara went alone. She found Cobb exactly as Silas described, sitting upright against the spruce trunk, with his legs stretched out in front of him and his hands in his lap, his head tilted back against the bark. The cold had preserved him perfectly. His eyes were closed. His expression was almost peaceful, which seemed wrong for a man who had spent his last week stealing food and sleeping in the open. The rust-spotted rifle lay beside him. His pack was open, its contents scattered by wind or animal. She searched the pack carefully. A few strips of smoked meat stolen from someone's cache, a broken compass, a pouch of tobacco half empty, a small leather notebook with water-stained pages, and folded inside the notebook a piece of paper that stopped her breath. It was a promissory note. "Thomas Whitmore owes Ransom Cobb $40 for timber received autumn 1874. Thomas's handwriting. Clara knew it the way she knew his voice, the cramped letters, the way he pressed too hard on downstrokes. Below the note in different ink, a single line. Whitmore departed Mason's Creek, took the North Pass. The North Pass, the route through the high gap where the mountain narrowed to a single trail between two cliff faces. The route that had been buried by a landslide in late October. Clara knelt in the snow beside the dead man and understood. Cobb had not killed Thomas. Cobb had followed Thomas to collect a debt gotten trapped on the mountain when winter closed in and slowly become the desperate, starving creature that had circled her shelter in the dark. The ring Thomas had left it at the trading post when he stopped to settle accounts before taking the shortcut home. Cobb picked it up there, a $40 debt. That was what had brought this man to her ridge. That was what had kept him prowling her snare lines instead of finding his own food. $40 in a winter that wouldn't end. She took the promissory note back to the shelter. That evening, after the children were asleep, she held the paper over the ember pit and watched it brown, then curl, then catch. "This debt is finished," she said. The paper crumbled into ash and joined the coals, and the orange light dimmed for a moment before steadying. But the note had told her something else. Thomas took the North Pass, the pass that collapsed, and no one had seen him since. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the silver ring still there, still cold, still carrying those 2 scratched letters. That evening, 6 people sat around the ember pit in the shelter Clara had dug with her own hands. It was crowded. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth and unwashed bodies and pine resin. Silas sat with his bad hand resting on his knee, his face still carrying the tight look of a man who had not fully accepted where he was. Margaret sat beside him, her shoulders touching his, her eyes on the fire. Dinah had positioned herself against the far wall with Ellie sleeping on her lap, the baby's head nestled into the crook of the girl's arm. 2 weeks ago, Dinah had called this place a hole for animals. Now she held another woman's child with the careful tenderness of someone who has discovered that comfort is not about the place. It is about the body next to yours. Wyatt talked, more than he had in the entire month since the cabin collapsed. He told Dinah about the figure he had made from twine scraps and wood, a stick man with pine cone hands that he had wedged into the wall beside the vent and named Mr. Warm. He said it was their watchman, their guardian, and that it kept bad things from coming in. Dinah smiled at him, and Wyatt, emboldened, asked Clara to give Mr. Warm eyes. Clara took a coal from the pit and burned 2 dots into the figure's face. Then she kissed Wyatt's forehead and set Mr. Warm back in his place on the wall. She did not cry. She did not need to hide anything. For the first time since the roof fell, she felt something other than fear or determination. She felt tired, but it was the tiredness of a woman who has laid her burden down for a moment, not dropped. It just set it on the ground long enough to breathe. She leaned back against the earthen wall, felt its warmth against her spine, and listened to the sounds of other people living in the space she had carved from nothing. She fell asleep before Wyatt did. It was the first time she had slept before her children since the night the cabin died. In her pocket, the ring sat heavy and silent. Thomas had taken the North Pass. The pass had collapsed. And somewhere on the other side of that question, the answer waited with the patience of buried stone. The thaw came with sound, not the slow, gentle drip of icicles surrendering to sun, but a roaring, cracking upheaval that shook the ridge from below. Streams burst from seams in the rock that had been silent for months. Trees shed their frozen loads in sudden crashes that echoed through the valley like distant gunfire. The snow did not melt so much as collapse, compressing under its own weight, pulling away from the hillside in sheets that slid downward and piled at the base of every slope. Clara spent 3 days clearing the roof of the shelter, replacing sod bricks that had shifted under the weight of ice, digging channels to redirect the meltwater that threatened to pool against the entrance. Her hands knew the work now. They moved without instruction, without hesitation, pressing and shaping and sealing with a precision that would have astonished her 6 months ago. But it was the silence between the sounds that unsettled her. The forest, which had been empty all winter, remained empty. No bird song returned with the warming air. No hoof prints appeared in the mud below the tree line. The mountain had been scoured clean, and what was left felt less like wilderness and more like aftermath. One morning, Wyatt sat beside the vent pipe and looked up at her with Thomas's dark eyes. "Are we the only ones left, Mama?" She did not answer him. She pulled on her boots, took the spade, and walked east farther than she had gone since she brought the Holtz back. Past the charred remains of a lightning-struck pine, past the outcrop where Thomas had once stood with his arm around her shoulder and said this was where they would build the smokehouse when they had enough timber. She found nothing. No cabins, no camps, no tracks of any kind. She called out once, her voice breaking against the trees and coming back empty. She returned with wet feet and a decision. The next morning she packed what little food they could spare, gave Wyatt the hunting knife again, kissed both children, and told Margaret she would be back in 3 days or she would not be back at all. Then she walked west. She found them on the second day. A young mother named Peg, perhaps 22, with a 3-year-old son named Calvin, who clung to her neck and would not let go. They were sheltering beneath an overturned wagon, its canvas cover shredded by wind, the bed filled with snow. Peg had been burning pieces of the wagon itself for heat, and there was almost nothing left. She stared at Clara with the flat, vacant expression of someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world and was merely waiting for it to finish with her. Clara gave her food, gave the boy water from her canteen. Then she said, "I have a place. It's warm. It's underground. Can you walk?" Peg walked. Calvin rode on Clara's back, his small arms locked around her throat so tightly she had to pry his fingers loose to breathe. A day farther west, she found an elderly couple, Emmett and Faye Jessup, living in a root cellar beneath the floor of their burned-out homestead. Emmett was 70 and nearly blind in one eye. Faye could still move, but slowly, and she had developed a cough that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. They had been eating boiled leather for a week. Clara led them all back. 5 days a round trip, the longest she had ever been away from the children. When she came through the trees and saw the shelter's entrance, saw Wyatt standing there with Ellie on his hip, and Margaret behind him wringing her hands, she felt her knees soften, and she had to lean against the rock wall to keep from going down. By early summer, there were 5 shelters along the ridge, each one patterned after the belly, each one dug into the slope and roofed with sod and sealed with everything Clara had learned to use. She taught Emmett to cut turf despite his failing eyes by letting him feel the blade's angle with his fingers. She taught Peg to stack bricks by weight, heaviest at the bottom, lightest at the crown. She showed Faye how to mix ash into clay for waterproofing And when Faye's hands shook too badly to work, Dinah took over without being asked. The ridge was becoming something. Not a town, not even a settlement. Just a collection of people who had watched everything they owned disappear and had decided to stay anyway. Then Abel Whitfield arrived, and the trouble changed shape. He came with a group of 4-2 families from somewhere south of the ridge, gaunt and trail-worn, but functional. Abel was 17, broad-shouldered, fast on his feet, and possessed of the kind of confidence that comes from never having been proven wrong about anything important. He had kept his group alive through the winter by sheer will and physical strength, and he carried that achievement in front of him the way some men carry a loaded rifle visibly and at all times. On his first day, Clara walked the new arrivals through the basics of shelter construction. She showed them where to cut sod, how to read the angle of the slope for drainage, where to place the vent pipe for optimal draw. Abel listened with his arms folded, his weight shifted to one hip, and when she finished explaining how to angle the drainage trench, he smiled. "You dig like a housewife or a miner." The words dropped into the silence like a coin into a well. No one laughed. Margaret's jaw tightened. Peg looked at the ground. Dinah, who had spent weeks learning everything Clara could teach her, turned to stare at the boy with open contempt. It was Silas who spoke, Silas who had called this place a grave with a door, Silas who had followed his wife here because he couldn't bear to watch her leave without him. He straightened up from the wall he had been leaning against and looked at Abel with the steady, unimpressed gaze of a man who had earned every callus on his remaining good hand. "You build me a wall that holds for 2 weeks, son. Then you can talk." Abel did not back down, but he stopped smiling. He took his group to a spot 50 yards north and began digging his own shelter. He made the roof flat. He skipped the drainage trench. He set the vent pipe straight up instead of angling it to catch the prevailing wind. He told his people it was a stronger design, simpler the way a man builds when he doesn't need to overthink things. Clara watched from the ridge and said nothing. When Margaret asked if she was going to warn him, Clara shook her head. When the rain comes, the ground will teach him. 2 weeks later, the late spring melt sent a rush of water down the slope. It hit Abel's flat roof like a river hitting a dam. The sod, which had no angle to shed the flow, absorbed it until it couldn't, and then the northwest corner of the ceiling sagged, buckled, and gave way in a cascade of mud and roots that buried half the interior. No one was hurt, but Abel's group spent the night outside, huddled under pine boughs while rain soaked them to the skin. The next morning, Abel stood at the entrance of Clara's shelter. His clothes were caked with mud. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His hands hung at his sides, and the confidence that had been sitting on his shoulders like a banner was gone. Not beaten out of him, just washed away, dissolved by the same water that had taken his roof. He did not apologize. He asked a question. "Can you teach me how to angle the trench?" Clara looked at him for a moment. She did not remind him of what she had said. She did not mention the housewife or the miner. She reached inside the entrance and pulled out the pickaxe and held it out to him. "Start here," she said. "Dig from the high side. Follow the water." She taught him that afternoon, and she did not teach him the way she had taught Dinah or Peg or even Silas. She taught him the way Thomas had once taught her, by placing her hands over his on the handle and letting him feel the right angle through muscle instead of words. She showed him how to read the soil, where the color changed from dark to light, where the moisture gathered, where roots would hold, and where they would give way. She showed him that the mountain was not something to be overpowered. It was something to be listened to, and if you listened carefully enough, it would tell you exactly where to put every stone and every brick. Abel listened. For the first time since he had arrived, he listened without folding his arms, without shifting his weight, without the faint smile that said he already knew better. He listened with his hands in the dirt and his knees on the ground, and his eyes on the woman who had kept 2 children alive through the worst winter this ridge had ever seen. When they finished, he looked at the completed trench for a long time. Then he picked up his tools and went back to rebuild his shelter without saying another word. Clara watched him go and felt something shift inside her that she had not expected. She had been a woman surviving, then a woman protecting, then a woman providing. Now she was something else, and she did not have a name for it yet, but it felt heavier than all the others combined and also somehow lighter. Garrett Pike arrived at the end of summer when the days were still long, but the light had begun to thin at the edges, carrying the first warning of autumn. He came alone, walking slowly, a thin man with hollow cheeks and a small knife on his belt, and nothing else. No pack, no rifle, no supplies. He looked like a man who had been emptied out and was moving forward only because stopping required a decision he no longer had the energy to make. The others wanted to turn him away. Emmett muttered about mouths to feed. Abel, now the strongest laborer on the ridge, stepped forward with his shoulders squared. But Clara waved them back and sat Pike down on the stone bench outside the common hall and gave him water and a strip of smoked meat and waited. Pike ate slowly. He did not look at her while he chewed. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and spoke in a voice scraped thin by exhaustion, in the particular kind of grief that comes from carrying news you do not want to deliver. "I worked with your husband," he said. "Mason's Creek, lumber crew, Thomas Whitmore." Clara's hands went still in her lap. "He left the first week of October. Same time you said. But he didn't head straight home. He stopped at the trading post to settle a debt man named Cobb, $40 for timber. Then he took the North Pass, said it was faster, said he wanted to get back to you before the snow." Pike paused. He looked at his own hands, then at the ridgeline above them, then at the ground. The North Pass collapsed on October 27th. Landslide took the whole face. 2 men saw it from the valley. Nobody crossed that pass and lived. He looked at Clara then, and in his eyes she saw the quiet apology of a man who had learned through long experience that the truth does not care whether you are ready for it. "He kept saying it," Pike said. 3 weeks. Over and over, like he was making a promise to someone who wasn't there. Clara sat very still. The evening light was fading, and somewhere inside the shelter behind her, she could hear Wyatt's voice high and clear telling Dina a story about Mr. Worm's latest adventure. Ellie laughed, a bright, sharp sound that cut through the stone walls and reached Clara where she sat, and she let it reach her. Let it land, let it exist alongside the thing Pike had just given her. She did not go to the ridge that night. She did not walk to the old trail. She stayed inside the shelter after the children fell asleep, and she took the silver ring from her pocket and set it on the flat stone beside the ember pit. The firelight caught the tarnished band, and the scratched letters glowed faintly. T.W. She looked at the ring for a long time. She did not speak to it. She did not whisper Thomas's name, or tell him she wasn't angry, or ask the empty air why he took the short route instead of the safe one. She had spent months saying things to a man who could not hear her, and she understood now that the words had never been for him. They had been for her a way of keeping him present, a way of pretending that the question still had an answer worth waiting for. The question was answered now. The waiting was over. And what surprised her was not the grief, which was enormous and sat on her chest with a weight she could feel in her breathing, but the absence of surprise. Some part of her had known since November. Some part of her had known since the first night in the hollow, when she dug into frozen ground by lantern light and did not once think about waiting for rescue. She had not been waiting for Thomas. She had been building without him, and the building itself had been her way of knowing. She folded the ring into a scrap of leather and tied it with a thin strip of rawhide. In the morning, she walked to the ridge to the place where the old trail began. The trail Thomas had taken on that last October morning. The path had disappeared under months of growth, just a faint dip in the grass where boots had once compressed the soil. She knelt and dug a small hole with her fingers, placed the ring inside and covered it with earth. She pressed her palm flat over the spot and held it there. "I'm not mad," she said, "but I'm still here, that's all." She stood up and walked back toward the shelters. On the way, she passed Bridger's camp. The old man was sitting outside his hide tent, his pipe in his teeth, his white beard catching the light. He had never moved to the ridge. He had never joined the others. But he was still there, within sight, within reach, occupying the space between solitude and community, the way he had occupied this mountain for 40 years. He called to her, the first time he had ever initiated a conversation. "Sit down a minute." She sat on a rock across from him. The sun was warm on her neck, and below them, the ridge spread out with its 9 shelters, each one venting thin curls of smoke into the morning air. "I've been on this mountain 40 years, Bridger said. He took the pipe from his mouth and held it in his lap, turning it slowly in his fingers. "I've watched men build cabins, watched cabins fall, watched men leave. I've never seen anyone dig into the mountain itself and make it hold her family alive." Clara said nothing. She watched his face, which was doing something she had not seen before. The flat, careful mask he always wore had loosened, and beneath it was something that looked almost like reverence, though she suspected he would have denied it if she named it. "Your husband died on that pass," Bridger said. It was not a question. "I knew since November. I was on the peak when the slide came down. Saw it from above. No one could have crossed." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at him. "You knew from the beginning." "I knew. And you didn't tell me." Bridger met her eyes. His were pale, watered by decades of wind and sun, but they did not waver. "If I had told you that first morning when you were standing in the snow with those 2 children and your cabin in pieces behind you, what would you have done? Would you have dug? Or would you have sat down in the snow and let the cold take you?" The question hung between them. Clara opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. She thought about that first morning, the darkness, the wind, Wyatt coughing, Ellie turning blue. She thought about the moment Bridger had walked away and left her alone, and how that abandonment had been the thing that drove the spade into the ground, the thing that turned grief into motion. "I would have dug," she said. Bridger nodded slowly. "I know you would have. That's why I left the rabbit." They sat in silence for a while. The smoke from the shelters rose straight up in the still air. 9 thin columns marking 9 families who had found their way to this ridge because a woman with blistered hands had refused to stop digging. "You should come down," Clara said. "There's room." Bridger put the pipe back in his teeth. "I've slept alone too long. Wouldn't know how to act with walls that close." He paused. "But I'll keep watch from up here, if that counts for anything." "It counts." She left him there and walked back to the belly. It was the longest conversation they would ever have. And both of them knew without saying it that it was also a goodbye of a kind, the farewell of 2 people who understood each other precisely because neither one had ever asked the other for comfort. Autumn arrived like a door closing. The air sharpened. The trees shed their leaves in a single week, as if they had been holding on out of courtesy and had finally lost patience. The grass on the ridge turned brown, then silver, then disappeared under the first dusting of frost. But this time every shelter had double walls. Every vent was stone-sealed against wind. Every root cellar was stocked with dried meat and smoked fish and bark flour and the wild potatoes that Peg had found growing along the creek bed in August. Smokehouses puffed steadily along the ridge, turning the last of the autumn catch into stores that would carry them through the dark months. When the first real snow came, no one ran. They gathered in the common hall, the 3rd chamber Clara had added to the belly with its stone benches and hide-covered walls, and the iron kettle that she had salvaged from an abandoned trapper's camp and hung from a beam above the central hearth. Smoke stained the ceiling black. The air smelled of pine resin and rendered fat, and the particular warmth that comes from too many bodies in too small a space. That first winter night, Ellie climbed into Clara's lap, tugged at her sleeve, and looked up with the wide, questioning eyes of a child who has learned to associate darkness with danger. "Fire stays?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, and the word fire came out soft, almost like a wish. Clara looked down at her daughter. Ellie's cheeks were full now, flushed from the heat. Her eyes were clear. Her fingers, once blue, were pink and warm and gripping Clara's collar with the fierce strength of a child who has decided she is not letting go. "Yes, baby, the fire stays." Wyatt pulled the entry flap tight against the cold and turned to look at his mother across the crowded room. He was taller now, his face thinner, his hands rough with calluses that no 5-year-old should have. But his eyes were steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who has earned the right to believe what he's saying. "We're deeper than the storm," he said. And they were. The snow piled higher than any mark on the walls. The wind howled through the passes and found nothing to tear at. Below the sod and stone the shelters held. Families passed food through doorways. Children laughed in tunnels between chambers. And in the belly, the first and deepest of them all, the fire burned steady, and the earthen walls stayed warm. A woman from the southern slope came with fresh salt. A young man came with seeds, corn, and beans and tobacco carried over the mountains in a leather sack. He stood in the common hall and looked around at the packed earth walls and the stone benches and the faces lit by firelight, and he said, "They told me the mountain belongs to you now." Clara laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first one she had let out in so long that the sound of it startled even her. "Nobody owns the mountain," she said, "but if you dig deep enough, it'll let you stay." The phrase caught. It spread from the belly to the other shelters, from the ridge to the valley, from the survivors to the newcomers who arrived with each passing season. Dig deep enough. It was carved into door lintels with hunting knives. It was scratched into hearthstones with nails. It was whispered to frightened children during the long nights when the wind made the mountain groan, and it meant more than survival. It meant the stubbornness to build where everything said you should flee. It meant the willingness to go lower when the world tried to crush you flat. Bridger died that third winter. Clara found him when the snow melted, sitting in his hide tent, with his pipe in his lap, his eyes closed, his body rigid and peaceful. He had died alone exactly the way he had lived, and she suspected he would have wanted it that way. She and Abel carried him to the highest point on the ridge and buried him under a cairn of flat stones. She placed a single slab of shale on top and carved one word into it with the point of her knife. Stayed. It was the only epitaph she could think of that he would not have argued with. The years did what years do. They accumulated, they softened some edges and sharpened others. Abel became the best builder on the ridge after Clara, his shelters tight and well-drained, his walls plumb as vents drawing clean. He never mentioned the flat roof or the housewife remark, and Clara never brought it up. Dinah learned to walk without a limp and became the person who taught the children in the common hall, scratching letters and numbers into slate with a nail while her students sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor. Peg remarried a man from the valley and moved into a proper cabin that he built her from fresh-cut timber, but she came back to the ridge every autumn to help with the harvest, and she always spent her first night sleeping in the belly on the same spot where Calvin had slept his first night, as if the ground there had a particular warmth that new wood could not replicate. Margaret and Silas stayed. Silas's frostbitten hand never fully recovered, but he learned to work with 4 fingers and a thumb, and he became the person who maintained the common hall, patching the hearth, replacing stones, keeping the kettle clean. He never spoke about the night he had called the belly a grave. But once, when a new arrival looked at the earthen walls with obvious skepticism, Silas walked over and placed his good hand flat against the sod and said, "This wall kept my daughter alive. Whatever you think you see, that's what it is." Ellie grew. She learned words the way some children learn songs in bursts and clusters, stringing them together into combinations that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't, but always carried feeling. Mama dig, fire warm, Wyatt mine. Each phrase was a small declaration, and Clara collected them the way other women collected pressed flowers, holding them up to the light of memory and turning them slowly, admiring their shape. Wyatt grew. He built his first shelter at 12, his second at 14, his third at 16. Each one was better than the last. He never said he was building them for anyone in particular, but the third one had a window cut into the south wall and covered with scraped hide, so thin the light came through amber and warm. And when Clara stood inside it and felt the quality of that light on her face, she knew he had built it for a life he hadn't started yet, but could already see. New families came. Each winter drove them higher each spring, revealed them blinking and thin at the edge of the tree line. They found the ridge and the shelters and the smoke rising from hidden vents, and they found Clara, who by then had stopped counting the seasons and started counting the people. She never turned anyone away. She never asked what they had lost. She only asked if they could work, and when they said yes, she handed them a tool and pointed them toward the slope. They called her things: the builder, the frost widow, the queen beneath the hill. She heard the names and did not correct them and did not encourage them. When someone asked her directly what she preferred to be called, she said, "A woman who didn't run." And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the truest thing she had ever said about herself, and the simplicity of it made it impossible to argue with. Even in old age, when her hands trembled and her hair had gone to silver, and the new generation had built straighter walls and smarter chimneys, and even installed windows made from glass scavenged from the valley, they still came to her. Not for instruction anymore, for something else, for stories, for the particular kind of truth that only comes from someone who was there at the beginning, who remembers what the ground felt like before it was tamed, who can describe the sound of a pickaxe hitting frozen earth at 3 in the morning by lantern light, with a baby crying behind her and the wind trying to find her in the dark. She told the stories. She told them in the common hall on winter evenings, with Ellie's children on her lap and Wyatt's children at her feet, and the fire painting shadows on the ceiling that Thomas would have liked. She told them plainly, without embellishment, without heroism, because the truth was heroic enough and did not need decoration. She told them about the cabin falling, about Bridger walking away, about Cobb's thin smile and the ring in the snow, about the night Ellie stopped breathing and the morning she started again, about the taste of bark flour and boiled leather and the first rabbit that Wyatt held above his head like it was the answer to everything. She never told them about the moment she knew Thomas was dead. That was hers. That belonged to the ground where the ring was buried on the old trail that no one used anymore, where the grass had grown over the last trace of the man who had promised 3 weeks and meant it with every part of himself, who had taken the short road because he wanted to get home faster, because he loved them, because love sometimes makes you choose the path that kills you. One evening, many years after the last of the original survivors had either died or moved to the valley, Clara sat at the edge of the ridge. The sun was going down behind the western peaks, and the sky was the color of embers, orange and deep red, and a purple so dark it was nearly black at the edges. Below her, the ridge spread out with its dozens of shelters and cabins, and the smoke of cooking fires rising into the still air. Children's voices drifted up from the common hall. Somewhere someone was singing. She could see the old trail from here. Or rather, she could see the place where it had been, now just a gentle depression in the grass, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She had not visited the ring in years. She did not need to. The ring was in the ground, and the ground was in her, and the two had become the same thing a long time ago. She sat there as the light faded and the first stars appeared. The same stars she had stood beneath barefoot in the snow on a night when she had nothing but anger and exhaustion and the wild, defiant refusal to let the cold win. The stars looked the same. She did not. She whispered it one last time, not because she needed to, because it had become a kind of prayer, a way of marking the distance between the woman who had first spoken those words and the woman who spoke them now. "I'm not mad, but I'm still here." The mountain did not answer. It never did. But the wind that came down from the peak was gentle, carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke in the first frost of autumn, and it passed over her without biting, so way a hand passes over the head of a sleeping child, touching, without waking, present, without pressing. Below her the belly held. The walls she had built with bleeding hands in the worst winter of her life still stood thicker now, reinforced by decades of hands that had followed hers but still recognizable, still carrying the shape of that first desperate excavation. The vent pipe she had carved from a hollow log still drew air, though it had been patched and extended a dozen times. The entrance still wore its curtain, though the hide had been replaced so often that nothing remained of the original buffalo skin Thomas had traded for. Everything had been replaced except the walls themselves. The earth Clara had packed with her fists on that third frozen mornings was still there, compressed and hardened by years of weight and warmth, holding the shape she had given it, holding the space she had carved for her children when there was no space left anywhere else in the world. The fire inside was burning. She could see its glow through the vent, a faint orange pulse against the darkening sky, steady as a heartbeat. It stayed.